All right, the second learning target for the chapter on cells and cell transport, learning target 2, is that students will be able to identify the structure and explain the function of the cell membrane. The cell membrane is a very, very important part of the cell because if you remember, it's the gatekeeper. It controls what goes into and out of the cell, okay? That's its function. And so whatever comes into our cells or leaves our cells, it's because of our cell membrane allowing that. So that's why we give it the nickname, the gatekeeper of the cell. And so we're going to be looking at the cell and looking at the structures that make up the cell membrane, the different proteins that are embedded throughout, and why the cell membrane has the arrangement it does to allow for passage of materials through. So first, we're going to look at what a phospholipid is, because the cell membrane is what we call a phospholipid bilayer. It has two layers of these phospholipids. So a phospholipid has two parts. The first part is called the hydrophilic head. So that's this part right here. And this is the phosphate part. You can see the phosphate with the phosphorus there. And then there's a glycerol added as well. So we need to know what these word fragments mean. Hydro, we've had that before when we talked about hydrolysis. That means water. But philic means loving. So this particular part of the phospholipid is water loving. It needs to always be facing wherever there's water. Again, it's made up of the phosphate part, and this part is polar, okay? This part of the molecule is polar. That means it has that charge on it, where one part of it is more positively charged versus negatively charged. The tails, and if you look here, there's two of them here. This is the hydrophobic tail. Again, hydro means water. Phobic, if any of you have a phobia of something, phobic means fearing. So the tails are hydrophobic. They do not want to be anywhere near water, okay? And this is the lipid portion. So you can even see these long chains. Remember, that's these are these fatty acids. So that's, if you think back to lipids, they have that kind of structure to them. They are also non-polar, okay? So they're made up of lipids and they're non-polar. So when we talk about a phospholipid, the phospho part is the head up here, and the lipid part is the tail down here, okay? So, like I said, the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. Bi means two. There's two layers of them. Two layers of phospholipids, and they arrange themselves so that the tails face each other and the heads face out. Well, why is that? That seems kind of odd that they'd be facing that way. Well, not really, because water is found inside the cell. That's what intracellular means, and outside the cell, extracellular. So if this right here is outside the cell, and this is inside the cell, you have a bunch of water in here, and you have a bunch of water out here. Remember, the heads are hydrophilic, water-loving. So the heads are always going to face wherever there's water because they're attracted to that water, okay? The tails are hydrophobic, so they don't want anything to do with water, so they just turn themselves away, and that's why they face each other. So this is our phospholipid bilayer. And this would stretch all the way around a cell, okay, to form that cell membrane that goes all the way around the cell. So it's not just a single layer. When we think of the cell membrane, it's actually made up of two layers of these phospholipids that go all the way around. Now, we say that the cell membrane has a fluid mosaic model, okay? The cell membrane is flexible. That's the fluid part. Those phospholipids and proteins in each layer, they can kind of move around from side to side and slide past each other. They're not fix in one spot. So if you look back here, these phospholipids can slide around right here, and one can move over here, one can move over there, and so on. They're going to still keep their arrangement with the tails facing each other and the heads facing out and in where the water is, but they can slide past each other. They're not fixed in one spot and frozen there. So that's the fluid part. But there's also a whole bunch of proteins embedded in the membrane. Okay? See all these different proteins? There's all sorts of proteins embedded in here. That's what makes it a mosaic. Okay? If you've ever seen a mosaic like this where all these different tiles are put together, sometimes they form kind of a shape of, an image of some sort, or maybe it just might be just different colors. So when we talk about the fluid mosaic nature of the cell membrane, it's fluid because the cell membrane is flexible and those phospholipids and proteins can kind of slide past each other and move. And it's a mosaic because there's lots of proteins embedded throughout the cell membrane. We also say that the cell membrane is selectively permeable. If you're selective, you're very choosy. Okay? We also call it semi-permeable. That term means the same thing. What it means right here is that some molecules can cross the membrane and others cannot. Okay? Some can cross. What might prevent molecules from moving inside? If they're too large, if they're polar, because guess what? If a polar molecule might not have problems with the phosphate head, but once it tries to go through the lipid tails, it gets repelled. And so some of these can't cross easily. Okay. So we talked that there's different membranes embedded in the cell membrane, and so we're going to talk about three major kinds of membrane proteins. Here's your phospholipid bilayer right here. Here's your double layer of phospholipids. The three main types we're going to talk about are receptor proteins, channel proteins, and marker proteins. Okay? So the first ones are marker proteins. They identify the cell to other cells. In other words, it marks the cell. Usually they have a carbohydrate chain on there, and that kind of helps signify what type of protein this is. Sometimes we call them the name tag. Of cell. It's kind of like your name tag because it helps identify your own cells from foreign invaders. So your immune system really checks that. The reason you show a response, like when a bacteria or a virus invades you, is because they have proteins on the surface of their cell membrane as well. And if our immune system sees that that's not part of you, it'll try to attack it. And so that's how your immune system works. And that's why marker proteins are very important for organ transplants or even blood transfusions, because if you're receiving cells from another person, like if it from an organ or from blood transfusion, and if it doesn't match up with your own marker proteins, then your body's going to try to attack it because that's how your immune system works. So that's why you need to make sure you get the right blood type if you're going to get a blood transfusion. That means when they try to find matches for organ donation, they try to look to family members first, especially your siblings, because if you have the same mom and dad, you hopefully will have most of the same kind of marker proteins on your cell surface. So marker proteins identify you. They say, not only is this your cell, but this is your liver cell. Like you have special marker proteins that identify liver cells from heart cells, from kidney cells, but it also identifies that they're your kidney cells, your liver cells, and so on. The second type is a receptor protein. That receptor protein helps to communicate between cells. It'll send information from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, okay? So it kind of receives that information. So an example might be if you have a receptor protein here and a hormone comes along and binds right into this spot right here, it might change this in such a way that it now sends a chemical message into the cell, and it'll tell the cell to start producing or producing something or releasing another enzyme or things like that. So hormones kind of help hook on to receptor proteins, and then the receptor protein relays the information into the cell. It changes in some way and relays that information into the cell. Channel proteins or transport proteins are just like the name suggests. They provide a passageway for materials to go through. So they move the materials through the cell membrane. It's still allowing passive transport, but it allows the materials that maybe a polar molecule can't go through these lipid nonpolar sections. So it'll allow then those polar molecules to go through, or larger molecules that need to get through, they can go through a channel protein. Remember, these are used with facilitated diffusion. We already talked about that. They have to use a protein channel to move the molecules through. So channel proteins allow for that passage of materials from one side of the cell to the other, whether they're moving things in or they're moving things out of the cell. We also can have what are called active transport pumps. These require energy, okay? So they actually move things from low concentration to high concentration against the gradient. And that's your sodium-potassium pump. That's really important in keeping your heart beating properly. You have to have this good right concentration of sodium-potassium on both sides of your membranes. And so these are actual pumps that will pump them across the membrane against the gradient. So that's another type of protein that can sometimes be used in active transport. Okay, so here this gives you some practice to draw in the cell membrane. And so if you were to first of all draw in some of your phospholipids like that, remember you have to make it a bilayer, excuse me. Okay, and let's say I wanted to make a channel protein here to allow passageway of materials in. This is my channel protein. And I'm going to draw some more of these phospholipids. You guys will do a much better, neater job than me. And now I'm going to do a receptor protein, or maybe a hormone can attach there. And then I'm going to draw a this is a very poor marker protein. I draw it bedded all the way through, but these are supposed to be your carbohydrate chains that kind of mark it. And that's your phospholipid bilayer. So there's your hydrophilic head. Hydrophobic tails. You'll have to be doing a where you'll have to model and make your own little model of the cell membrane, so you can be finding different crafty materials that can help you make some of these things for it to work. Okay, and that's the cell membrane.